I'm sorry to say this about such a beloved game, but in my opinion, the characters of Mafia 2 are largely disappointing. There are a precious few that I cared about, but those I did I felt were impactful more in their place in the overall narrative rather than as a result of their characterization. Much like our Mafia Definitive character video, I'm going to make some points about each character and what they did or didn't do on Mafia 2's behalf. This video contains full spoilers for both the characters and the game's overall narrative. If you haven't played Mafia 2, please watch at your own discretion regarding spoilers. Luca and Carlo are the two main bosses that Vito and Joe work for over the course of the story. The most recognizable trait about Luca is his mustache. That's literally all I remembered about him throughout the story, and the only way I could identify him throughout any of this. He is later turned into some sort of ground meat later on, so that's pretty gruesome and cool. As for Carlo, he's some guy. You and Joe shoot him at the end of the game, and that's about it. Unlike the first Mafia's Don Morello and Don Salieri, the main Mafia bosses of this game really suck and don't have a lot of development beyond being described as bad guys that we need to kill. Both of them basically see Vito and Joe and whomever else they can use as disposable peons. They're pretty basic capitalist opportunists who aren't very intelligent, and I honestly don't know how they came to the positions they're in, as they also seem largely incompetent. Steve Coyn. Steve I really like, but not because he's cool or actually likable or anything like that, but because Steve is a basic, blunt object, and I mean that pretty literally. You look at Steve and you're just, yeah, that's Steve. You look at him and you know that this is what you get. He is dumber than the peers holding up the docks, and this dude is always reading some sort of nudie mag when we see him. He's Derek's number two, but not because of how smart or how helpful he can be in running Derek's business, but because he's dumb, simple, and not at all afraid or averse to committing violence for the hell of it. That makes him a perfect hammer to hang around on Derek's tool belt. As for Derek Pappalardo, he is much better as a character, and he might be the best antagonist in the game. This is because Derek is a sneaky, conniving, slimy little bastard, and the dude is smart. He's good at using people without them necessarily realizing it. Also, because the space he occupies in and influence he's had on Vito's life, largely without Vito's knowledge, he's also a much more personal and intimate figure that stands in opposition to Vito's ambitions, and he does so for multiple generations of the Scaletta family. Derek is really well thought out. He's got a small, somewhat challenging boss fight that comes just after one of the better shootouts of the game, and he serves as a looming threat throughout the game because of his relationship with Vito's father and the legacy they've created above him. Derek displays an intricate type of ruthlessness and predation, a type laced with a healthy dose of smugness and sadism. He knows what power he held over Vito's father, used it to brutalize the poor man's life into oblivion. And yet when he meets Vito, the son of the man he removed from the world, he sees not an opportunity for repentance or reparation or even regret, but as an opportunity to take advantage of yet another young man desperate to make a mark in an effort to stake out his place in the world. In addition to the narrative, Derek is also one of the only characters in the game to give Vito recurring work outside of opportunities for making money presented in the main story. At one point in the game, the ability to sell stolen cars at the docks on Derek's behalf is unlocked, and it's one of the few side jobs Vito can take in order to acquire wealth and later repay Bruno. As a game feature, this isn't a bad idea, but the execution could have used more work. For example, in the game as is, the vehicles that Vito can steal and sell are stolen from generic NPCs once one spawns into the world, while Vito is in one of the eligible districts. Districts are divided by economic and ethnic status. Instead, I think it would have been more valuable for Derek to have wanted specific vehicles from specifically written characters. Before their time, we could have had Arthur Morgan type collections or Franklin Clinton style repo missions. Instead, imagine if Vito had been sent after some of his father's friends, other young Italian immigrants he may have grown up with, or even fellow war veterans and their families. This was a great opportunity to add more character and depth into Mafia 2's world and that of Derek and Vito and their relationship. As it is, it's a fairly annoying, repetitive, and frustrating series of basic fetch missions, partially mired in RNG. Alright, Henry Tomasino. I didn't like him. Don't get me wrong, Henry is a handsome man, and his voice actor flatters him appropriately. Henry from afar seems like a stand-up gentleman, an honest and trustworthy fella. He seems like a real man's man in the same way that Joe is a bro's bro. He seems more sophisticated and by extension more successful, but Henry is one of my least liked characters in this entry. Why? Well, from the first moment we meet Henry Tomasino, he sends Vito out on a job that he himself would never do. It's supposedly lucrative, allegedly risky, but undoubtedly achievable, and yet, despite all of that, he'll only follow through with the job if someone else puts their hands on the stolen goods and hands them to him. This was our first and arguably best red flag. In the next instance, Henry asks a freshly freed Vito to vouch for his accession into Carlo's crime family. One question I had here is why the fuck would Henry need a good word from a jailbird for a new job? Didn't Vito get caught? I mean, yeah, he kept his mouth shut for 6 years, but he still did significant time for a federal robbery, in part because of his competence and naivete. A robbery arranged by Henry. Also, what the hell has Henry been doing for the 6 years that Vito's been in prison? Shouldn't he be higher up in an organization by now? Even Joe, who's not nearly as put together as Henry seems to be, he's not a good associate, is what I'm saying. He's not a good friend. He's not how people have described him online after all these years. The next reason to realize that Henry's a shitty person is that he convinces Joe and Vito to buy smuggled Chinese heroin and distribute it to the people of Empire Bay. There are a few reasons this sucks. One, it serves to ravage the already vulnerable, destitute populations of black and immigrant peoples in the city. Second, it directly lies in opposition to the widely known mafia tradition of staying out of the heroin trade, in part because of its well-documented deleterious effects on communities, but also because of the risks associated with sky-high and decades-long penalties that come with hard illicit drug convictions. The drug trade also opens up all of the members to the mafia, even higher-ranking members, to potential criminal charges for the actions of their underlings due to American legislation like RICO. While RICO didn't come until 1970, similar but less effective law enforcement efforts were still a thing in the 1950s. Put another way, where moonshining or bootlegging or illegal gambling or light extortion or prostitution or whatever else all may result in less severe penalties, drugs like heroin and crack cocaine were not and remain much too high of a risk to manufacture and distribute compared to their potential street value. The mafia knows this, and they prevent these ventures explicitly for these reasons. And yet Henry not only breaks a practical mafia tradition, but he also pressures Joe and Vito into going along with them without giving them the time or consideration to come up with an alternative. Finally, we found out that Henry is an informant for the FBI. This really puts me in a shitty mood because all this time, all these years, people who played this game before I did have been making excuses for Henry. Henry's well-spoken. He's so cool. He'd never be a rat to Vito, and all that's copium. With Tommy Angelo, he turned over his whole crime family, but he did it in order to save his family. While I wasn't fond of the decision, I understood where Tommy stood when he decided to sell out those he'd worked with for so many years. With Henry, he has no wife, no children, no family to speak of. He's also been involved in 2 crime families, one the result of our influence, which means he could compromise potentially 2 organizations with the knowledge he can acquire and turn over to federal authorities. My point is, he's selfish. He's not doing this for anyone but himself, for his own enrichment. If we infer a step further, it's also possible that Henry's plan to spread heroin across the city is an explicit goal of the federal government, and the theme of governmental interference is something we will absolutely see in Mafia 3. So this theory does kind of hold up. If an Italian gangster being subsidized by the FBI buys Chinese heroin and distributes it amongst the black population of the city, isn't that a form of state-sponsored violence, just absent the state's fingerprints on it? Wouldn't that make Henry a capitalist, a rat, a poisoner, and an accessory to state-sponsored terrorism? Well, yeah, it would, and that makes him a piece of shit. Listen, ultimately, Henry was turned into Chinese firewood because he was a shitty, selfish person who only looked out for himself and never considered or prepared, if he even cared, for how the consequences of his actions would affect others. He's not a bad character, but he is a character that I strongly disliked and wanted to keep Vito from following along with throughout the narrative. Leo Galante is he's kind of a grandfather, or maybe your grandfather's friend. He's an old dude with an old school attitude, and he doesn't really have time for shit that doesn't matter. He's low-key, refined, kind of intelligent and thoughtful that doesn't show up very often in mafia and crime media, and he exhibits a kind of careful yet casual consideration of everything at play, and he seems to come up with solutions that are both creative and largely fair and equitable to everyone involved, and that's really great leadership. Leo is the closest thing we have to a good person throughout Mafia 2, and I can't say much more without spoiling some of Mafia 3, but Leo is far cooler and more badass than we give him credit for. We'll get to that later.
Hey, what the hell's going on? Where they taking Joe?
So, the Women of Mafia 2. In my critique character video of the first Mafia, I criticized the treatment and admission of Sarah, Tommy's partner. I lamented that women are a more important and more integral part of Mafia life and culture, and in that title, I said that I wish she and other women were better represented. That improvement kind of happens here, but only marginally. To Vito's credit, he tries to honor his family's needs, but he does so in almost explicitly the opposite way they ask him to. Maria, his mother, asks him to go down to the docks to get a job that pays an honest dollar for an honest day's work. Instead, Vito goes to the docks and gets a job that entails beating the dollars out of the hands of the honest men who've done their own honest day's work. As far as their relationship, it doesn't really develop further as she dies. When Francesca, his sister, asks him to talk to her husband about his drinking and his violent outbursts towards her, Vito tracks him down, brutalizes him, and then sends him home after threatening his life. When he does so again to Francesca, she demands he never contact her again. As far as we know, Vito never had any further contact with his sister for the rest of his life. Earlier in the game, Vito defends one of Joe's paid companions by beating a man into the snow after the man collided into her vehicle with his. Vito doesn't try to de-escalate or apologize for the situation on her behalf. He simply fights the man and prevails upon him as the strong, masculine, virile protector that he is. In other words, Vito cares about women, but he doesn't respect them very much. Instead, he seeks to assert his own power and dominance over other men in a way that flatters his own self and his masculine ego, but isn't conducive to taking care of the problem in a peaceful, honest, or equitable way as the women in his life usually ask him to. Finally, the final primary way women are featured in Mafia 2. Every once in a while, whether during a mission or out in the open world, Vito can come across an open issue of the real-life Playboy magazine, the main central pinup photograph only, not the actual issue with any articles or text, to ogle a beautiful woman in one pose of many featuring varying degrees of nudity. In one hand, it was pretty funny to see and served as a bit of a palate cleanser to be able to pick up and look at the photo of a well-lit, well-composed shot of a beautiful, mostly naked woman while in the middle of a gunfight. In the other hand, it felt pretty silly to be so focused on that same beautiful naked woman while in the middle of a gunfight. While the addition of these real-life historical artifacts is a welcome one, they also serve to once again highlight just exactly how women are considered but regarded in Vito Scaletta's Empire Bay, as objects to be prized and ogled, listened to, but not heeded. It should be a surprise to no one that Mafia 2 takes a few liberties in including many of its inspirations in its story, mostly absorbing them, but stopping just enough to show the protruding edges of the original poking just out from its fairly tightly scripted form. The most prominent and most recurring inspiration that I recognize was from the 1990 film Goodfellas. There are two scenarios almost wholly lifted from that film that I want to mention here. The first in Mafia 2 is the burial of Frankie Potts, which is in some ways a parallel to the murder and burial of Billy Batts. In Goodfellas, Batts, a made man within the family, is at a welcome home party after serving a lengthy stint in prison, much like Vito does. Jimmy and Tommy, fellow mafioso, but not made in the organization's eyes, suddenly and violently kill Batts after he kindly asks for a welcome home shoe shine. Along with Henry, Goodfellas' protagonist, the two of them load up Batts into the trunk of their car and drive it out into the country in order to bury the evidence. This murder isn't planned. It's a crime of rage, passion, and spontaneity. Killing a made man as an underling is a huge liability, one that's sure to have adverse consequences. Later, the trio find out the initial burial site is set for building development, and they vomitously labor to relocate the body. Ultimately, this is a hastily carried out murder done by men who both commit the act and commit to cleaning up the mess. Their ambition and initiative, while misdirected, are apparent, and they do their best to follow through on the consequences with the murder in a competent manner. In Mafia 2, the burial takes place after a night of debauchery and drinking upon Vito's release from prison, as Joe, Carlo, and others welcome back into the life. Later that night, drunk as all hell, they clumsily and sloppily bury Potts, a recently discovered informant for the FBI. Unlike Batts, Potts' killing is premeditated and done for organizational reasons, security reasons involving protecting the integrity of the family and its illicit ventures. The killing itself seems sound, and yet we learn that Frankie Potts has been ripening in the trunk of this car for 2 whole days prior to us climbing into it with Vito. We drive the car to the specified chosen middle of nowhere, one of very few in the city, and proceed to drunkenly and vomitously labor to bury Potts' body. The problem with this isn't the killing itself, or the fact that Joe, Vito, or anyone else is witness or accessory to the murder. The issue here is that it took 2 whole days for this organization's leadership to even delegate getting rid of a whole-ass cadaver. For Vito's part, it's even worse for him because instead of coming home from prison to a successful, profitable criminal enterprise he can step right into, he's instead tasked with the bitch work of burying a days-old aged corpse. The point of this scene is similar to Goodfellas with bats, to show the violence, short-sightedness, and unpredictability of some who frequent criminality. Specifically, it reinforces both to Vito and the player that those 6 years of hard time he served weren't valuable to his superiors, and is yet another reality check as he's returned only to be forced back into the basic grind of the unglamorous labor of trying to make an illicit living on the streets of Empire Bay. The second aspirational pull from Goodfellas is the character of Spider, presented in Mafia II's incarnation of Marty. Spider is basically a teenager who hangs around the actual mafioso in Goodfellas, serving them drinks, laughing at their jokes, and lighting their cigars. He's largely there to stroke their egos as he holds them in a sort of aspirational contempt. We don't see him do any illicit work or explicitly engage in any criminality, but he certainly seems to aspire to. Marty, on the other hand, is the sweetest, coldest badass who's ever lived in these games. Initially a hangaround for Joe, he actually does accompany Vito and Joe on multiple occasions that call for violence. Even more than that, Marty answers that call enthusiastically and competently, in one instance saving Vito's life by killing a man, and in another by serving as the would-be getaway driver for a major hit attempt on a rival mob boss in a hotel that's to be carried out by Joe and Vito. This job goes awry, however, and Marty's unceremoniously gunned down in that parking garage. Joe takes this extremely hard, and this unfolds in a scene whose actual depth initially completely eluded me. Fortunately, a YouTube critic by the name of Noah Caldwell-Gervais, a game critic of much more academic focus than most, had already come to the rescue years past by having delved deep into the casual racism and callousness exhibited by both Joe and Vito in this scene. I'll defer to his excellent analysis here.
This is one of the things that really stands out about the Mafia series. It isn't shy about reaching for serious political themes and taking a definitive artistic viewpoint on them. It explores crime, it explores national identity, it explores gender, it explores race. Even back here in the second game, racial themes are simmering just under the surface. It's only the game's fidelity to an Italian-American mob story, with telling a story in this particular and classic voice, which prevents the themes from taking greater prominence. One of Vito's very first jobs out of the army is to go steal a car from the black neighborhood on Mike Brusky's behalf. It's on this trip that Vito first spies the house on Hunter's Point, a dream that seems in reach one day, with the kind of money he's making with Joe. Not so for the car's owners. It's the nicest car on the block, and Vito and Joe make off with it without regard or regret. Later, when Marty dies, Joe falls into a drunken depression. He heads down to the same neighborhood he stole that car from years before. The bartender calls Vito, doesn't call the police, he calls Vito, because Joe's waving a gun around and acting crazy. The bartender closes up, and he waits. When Vito gets there, Joe waves the gun around again, and then pulls the trigger while gesturing wildly. He shoots the bartender. So you drag the bartender's body. The body of this working-class innocent who was honestly trying to do Joe a favor, to the trunk of the bartender's own car. Then you drive the car to Mike Brusky's crusher, and the man's life, his body, his car, his unspoken history, just disappears. You can see this as an accident if you want. You can take Joe's side. Joe didn't kill him because he was black, but because he was black. Joe and Vito could murder him for no reason whatsoever and never expect to see a single consequence or follow-up question. He wouldn't be missed. Joe wouldn't have been drinking there in the first place if it was a neighborhood where he could be held accountable for himself. So it's not a racist crime, but it's a crime with a racial angle. Again, this isn't knocking the game for its inclusion. This is a major turning point in how Vito sees Joe, in Vito's disillusionment with the glamour of who they are and what they do. It's a turning point in how the player is meant to see things as well. Dragging that bartender's body is a shameful thing to do, and it's not portrayed as a frivolous matter. Joe's rotten. He's got something rotten and selfish deep within him. And yet, loyalty prevents Vito from doing anything but be his friend.
The way this parallels Goodfellas is in the casual and callous murder of Spider. As I said, Spider is little more than a hangaround as well, but his hands, as far as we know, are completely clean. He can't claim the bravado or competence that young Marty could, but he still wants to emphasize his manliness and his ability to keep pace with whom he perceives as real, dangerous men. At one point, Tommy, being a tormentous prick, unintentionally shoots Spider in the foot. This is brushed off as just another unfortunate side effect of Tommy's devil-may-care nature and brutish temperament. Later in the film, Spider limps back and forth through the same table, serving drinks for the men while also enduring insult after insult from Tommy regarding his new limp. Summoning his courage in order to be a similarly dangerous man, one brave enough to stand up to the notoriously violent Tommy, Spider basically tells the gangster to go fuck himself. Chided on and goaded by Jimmy, the man who helped him viciously beat, stab, and dispose of the maid bats earlier in the film, Tommy proceeds to gun down the little Spider right there in that same room with all the other men who sit enjoying their card games, cigars, and drinks, served to them personally by the boy. That young man was gunned down in that room because of the fragile, emasculated ego of one man whose emotional immaturity had perhaps not even surpassed his own. Henry, for the second part in the film, looks at Tommy in incredulousness and shock, the glamorous gangster lifestyle once again shattered by the realities of sudden violence and unnecessary death. For Vito, Joe's killing of the black bartender plays a similar role. Rather than being a proficient, competent, illicit businessman surrounded by proficient, competent peers, Vito realizes that as long as he's affiliated with these men, Joe included, a not insignificant part of his life will consist of an arduous cycle of misplaced, mistimed violence at the hands of others, and he constantly have to dirty his own hands in order to clean those messes up. In both Goodfellas and Mafia II, the grim reality of criminality devastates the glamorous facade of the fantasy of a made mafioso's lifestyle. Unlike Henry, however, Vito doesn't seem too shocked by the murder and seems much less like Henry and more like Jimmy, in that he instead seems more irritated at how he's being inconvenienced by the murder rather than shocked by the murder itself. He's not averse to violence or disillusioned to it in the way that Henry is, and that's a consistent character trait exhibited by Vito. Okay, so why this aside? Why do I mention this, and why is it important? Because video games are still a relatively young and somewhat immature medium, and as a young medium, just as any younger sibling, video games look up to their older, more developed, and mature counterparts for both inspiration, and they often imitate them in an attempt to claim their perceived legitimacy for their own. By adopting and adapting some of Goodfellas' ideas, Mafia II seeks to replicate the prestige and demonstrate its own competence and gain prestige within its own medium by adopting the ideas of another. Is it perfect? Absolutely not, mostly due to what I felt was poor camera work, but also due to the quality of the scenes being diminished by the technology of the times. Having said that, Mafia II's attempts are earnest and competent in such a way that their convincing has inspired aspirational efforts that land well within their audience. In other words, this is just a tribute.
Welcome, welcome home, this is.
So, Joe Barbaro. I think Joe is one of the most enduringly well-liked characters who serve as the main sidekick of sorts for a protagonist. Much like Cyberpunk 2077's Jackie Wells, Joe is an earnestly loyal companion to the player and their in-game counterpart. And he serves as a sight for sore eyes for Vito as he returns home both times, both from war and from prison. On the other hand, it's directly because of Vito's association with Joe that he's ripped from his life in Empire Bay on both occasions. In the first, we're shown that Joe and Vito were caught by a cop mid-robbery, and while Joe was trying to get away, Vito was convicted and sentenced to military service. It might be because of this that Joe is so loyal to Vito, but I attribute it more to the fact that the men have been friends since boyhood. It's simply a lifelong friendship that's as equal parts profitable as it is dysfunctional. After all, without Joe's help, it's very possible that Vito would spend his days laboring at the docks like his father, making just enough money to afford rent and food just long enough for the next check to arrive. Despite the risks, Vito is able to afford a fairly nice home in the city's suburban waterfront at one point in his criminal career. Let me say it over. Despite the risks, Vito is able to afford a fairly nice home in the city's suburban waterfront at one point in his criminal career, and that wouldn't have been possible without Joe's help. But just because he's a fan favorite doesn't answer the question I've been answering here. How did I feel about Joe? Well, I both don't care for Joe and I like him quite a lot. Let's start with the fact that Joe is not a man. Not really. He's brash and he's loud, and he's no problem pulling out a gun or other weapon and using it to the fullest extent of violence that he wishes. Consequences be damned. He's also shown to be quite short-sighted, and while I wouldn't say Joe is sadistic or even selfish, he is very much a creature of immediate gratification, and he displays almost no forethought or long-term planning for his life, criminal career, or even the welfare of Vito. Joe wants money, he wants to fuck, and he wants to be seen as not just a man, but a big man, large of stature and status, a man to be envied. Not looked up to, but envied. Joe's a decent enough sort, as we see when he's with Vito or Marty. He's not abrasive or abusive, and he doesn't demean or degrade either of them. To Vito, he's a loyal friend and business partner. And to Marty, he's a kind of mentor who's doing the best he can. But his temper, his temperament, and his actions overall preclude him from being so to a more worthwhile extent. Another side of Joe that's well emphasized but also very much understated is his capacity for empathy and his often apparent range of emotional affectations. In both cases of losing a close associate, Joe reacts with genuine shock and distress. He's scared. He's angry. In each moment, he's mostly at a loss of how to help or make things better and instead reaches for the main emotional tool at his disposal, that of anger. Joe's primary response to feeling painful emotions such as sadness, regret, or anguish are to lash out in anger and to cause pain and hurt to those he's perceived as causing such loss. Joe does display a much more rich emotional range than most of the main characters, but the potential for more character development is in part squandered by our limited interactions with him. Where he could be a more mature man, more cognizant and considerate of the risks associated with his lifestyle, his growth both as a character and as a person remain largely unrealized. Instead, Joe presents as an immaculate man-child, one who displays a perpetual sense of stagnation and a lack of growth toward the maturity that most men will hopefully earn as they age and grow and successfully or unsuccessfully navigate various life experiences. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing in the story, by the way. Mafia 2 is in many ways many teenage boys and young men's dreams. After all, Joe has sex without consequence, without pregnancy, without disease, without commitment. Joe has a nice enough apartment. He has gainful employment where, for the most part, he's his own boss in what he does and how he does it. As long as he brings in the money, he gets to call the shots. He has no one to hold him back or tell him no. He's his own man, and the limits he has are ephemeral. If they exist, they certainly don't seem to matter to him. He's also established and dependable enough to have a modest number of contacts around Empire Bay that he can partner up with to make that money. Ultimately, Joe has fun. The deaths of his friends notwithstanding, Joe truly loves this shit. And most importantly, Joe loves and has Vito. Just as Joe is to both Vito and the player, Vito serves as Joe's anchor in the world. Even when Vito is sentenced to prison, Joe doesn't dick around. He doesn't dispose of his friend or forget his bond with Vito. Instead, he endeavors to hunt down the people informed on his friend, only leaving when it's deemed too unsafe to stay in the city. With no family that we really know of, Joe's just as alone, just as aimless, and just as desperate as Vito to overcome his own perceived shortcomings and rise up in the world. It's just a different type of hardship. Vito's father looms heavily over his life, and much of Vito's actions and attitude are a direct effort to refuse reliving his father's fate, whereas Joe's goal isn't so much a personal legacy to overcome and reflects instead a societal one, that classic story, the American dream, of going from rags to riches. Just like Mafia 1, Mafia 2's story is about men who are desperate to escape the rat race of and deleterious effects of capitalism during a turbulent, economically poor period in United States history. Unlike the first Mafia, however, Joe remains a steadfast and loyal, if dysfunctional, ally throughout. He's very much parallel to the first game's Paulie, only with a lot more enthusiasm and a lot less self-awareness for the Mafia lifestyle. Joe is also, in my opinion, one of the reasons Mafia 2 has remained so enduringly popular. I say this because Joe is a great example of a persistent male aspiration across American culture that spans generations. Speaking for my own, Mafia 2 came out in 2010. At this time, I was about 22 years old, freshly out of the military, full of hot red blood and warm white testosterone. I also thought I had the world by the balls, and I thought I knew everything there was to know about it. In many ways, a friend like Joe and the unrestricted freedom he and Vito seemed to have were exactly what I wanted in life. For men my age now, my mid-30s, I hope that Vito and Joe are seen for the naive, brutish imbeciles that they are. but boys and young men who are new to life and in many ways the real world may see Joe as we did, as a ride or die, a loyal, manly best friend to whom we'd like to aspire to, someone we'd like to perhaps befriend in real life. Joe stands as a kind of archetype, somewhat of a buddy cop, but also as a symbol of the modern outlaw, but in an invincible and charming kind of way that presents the world as one's for the taking and without the adverse consequences that are lived in real world so often painfully exhibits. Overall, I really like Joe as a character. He's a great companion to the player, and he's a hell of a lot of entertaining fun. Whereas Vito sees this job as just a business, a way to make money, Joe really embodies the enthusiasm for the lifestyle and appreciation for the freedom of life that being an outlaw brings in a way that almost no other character does in the first 2 games. Finally, we make it to Vito. In many ways, the Mafia trilogy is not a compilation of separate stories across multiple decades, but it is instead about the life of Vito Scaletta specifically. After all, when we meet Tommy, we first do so in his early 20s as he's sitting in his cab. Vito, on the other hand, we meet as a child as he and his family immigrate into the United States from Italy. Vito also, in a way, meets Tommy and ends their acquaintance almost as soon as it begins. In this moment, we receive the first game's absolute conclusion in such a way that propels us through the remaining narrative of Mafia II. Unknown at the time, Vito also features rather prominently in Mafia 3, a story in which we'll get to in another video. Also, before I go on, please remember that this is my interpretation of Vito, and that interpretation is partly going to be based on Vito's writing and portrayal within the game, but it's also going to be necessarily and irrevocably affected by how I interacted with Vito within the world, and by extension, how the world reacted to our decisions. If your interpretation or opinion of Vito is completely different than mine, that's okay. Subjectivity is a wonderful part of this medium, and I very much appreciate your interest in my subjective experience. If you had a different experience with Vito and or a different interpretation, I'd love to hear why in the comments. Overall, how did I feel about Vito? Well, I didn't and do not like him. Vito, like Henry, is handsome, well-spoken, and chivalrous enough considering the time period. But Vito is also boring as hell, and he's not very bright. Consider that Vito and Joe's first robbery is committed by breaking into a fucking well-lit glass front of a jewelry store. And not for a manageable amount of jewelry either, but a heaving sack of them. These dumbasses look like Santa Claus. He goes to jail, goes to Europe, and then becomes a legitimate member of what is today known as the Greatest Generation. He serves honorably on the battlefield for years until an injury sends him home to recover. At this point, Vito is a wounded veteran and a legitimate war hero. He could do so much with these experiences, from writing to working for the government in a military support capacity. He could work in politics, he could find good paying office work, he could work in marketing or advertising, helping with propaganda, or perhaps in a newsroom or television studio, giving colleagues a better idea of the war and its realities. Instead, his little dumbass comes back to hang out with Joe and sleep in his underwear on the couch by Joe's kitchen window. That just doesn't make sense to me. Speaking from my own experience, when I came back from my military training, I very quickly organized my time and my finances to go back to college, using these experiences to help inform how I'd like to live my life and see it develop going forward. Like I said, Vito's decision isn't an intelligent one, considering the multitude of options available to him. The next reason I don't think Vito is all that smart is one I've already touched on, that of Vito's decision to help commit a federal crime on federal property on Henry Tomasino's behalf. If there's ever a reason not to do something, it's because the person you look up to and aspire to be like won't even touch the damn thing themselves. It's a huge red flag that Vito just doesn't seem to consider at all. The next is probably one in which I basically screamed internally at the most, and that's Vito's decision to go along with Henry's plan to buy and distribute heroin. Again, not only is this a vile thing to do to the people of the city, but it's also a direct violation of his organization's well-reasoned stipulations. And while I'm usually all about fuck the system, this one is well-intentioned for both the overall group and for its individuals, and is overall a very sound organizational decision that he should have paid heed to. But Vito, dumbass that he is, just goes along with it. It takes literal seconds for his dumb ass to be convinced of this obviously atrocious business venture. Again, Vito is not an intelligent or thoughtful man. He's simple, he's brutish, and he doesn't actually do much beyond being good at getting caught up in other people's business. Even absent the agency and decision-making of the player, Vito just doesn't exhibit a lot of character or agency as an individual on his own. What he does exhibit, however, is consistent callousness and disregard for the people around him. He doesn't visit his mother often, and he disregards his sister's wishes in helping her deal with the challenge of an unhappy and abusive marriage. When Marty is killed, Vito doesn't react nearly to the extent that Joe does. To be fair to Vito, Marty was Joe's hangaround, not his. Marty's not someone he's very close to or is invested in as much as Joe is. Vito is also an infantry-trained soldier who's been explicitly taught that the mission remains front of focus instead of taking time to mourn casualties. But he also displays that same selfishness when Henry is carved into a Chinese entree. Joe is distraught, both at the brutality of the killing and suffering as of his associate, whereas Vito only cares about the money Henry was supposed to have on his person. Again, I understand that Vito is serving as the voice of reason in this situation, but his reactions also stand in contrast to Joe's much more emotive and empathetic reactions to losing his friends and partners along the way. Again, what does Vito actually do in Mafia 2? He lets himself, time and time again, be dragged into and spat out from the incompetent machinations and ill-considered spontaneous decisions of others. He is not a man of intelligence or of forethought, and is instead one motivated almost singularly by the ghost of his father and the life he lived as a child. And what does he gain? Exile. Vito gains exile. I would even say appropriately so. In the end, I believe that Leo Galante correctly estimates Vito as a major liability, one who just can't help but to fuck up almost every opportunity he touches. What keeps Vito alive, then, isn't his competence at crime or his proficiency at killing, but his loyalty to the man who mentored and employed him in prison. After all, aside from Joe, Leo is, as far as we know, the longest and most important relationship in Vito's life. Leo also stands in as the father figure that Vito is so badly missed. Without his decision to do the right thing by Leo, I don't believe either man would have lived beyond this story. Speaking of stories, while we have to end this analysis here, Vito's isn't over. We'll see him later when he meets the protagonist of Mafia 3, a small mountain of a man with a city to dismantle. After playing it through twice, how do I feel about Mafia 2? In all honesty, I'm very conflicted. I went from loving to hating to theoretically loving to appreciating to writing off the game completely at some point, only to circle back to loving it again. Much like I said in our Mafia 1 videos, my biggest complaint is that there aren't enough opportunities to interact with characters or the open world of Empire Bay. Now, at the end of this project, I can honestly say that Mafia 2 was a great game when it launched, and it stands firmly as one of the best game narratives that had released at the time. It's a title that incorporates ideas from a more mature artistic medium of film and presents its own ideas within a narrative that deeply respects the artistic, creative medium of the interactive experience. However, it is aged, and newer, more ambitious, more impactful titles have since superseded it. I did not find Mafia 2 to be a great game, but I did find it to be a good one, and it holds a respectable place in both my personal gaming library and within the medium as an influential, informative experience that I do believe every fan of the crime genre should experience for themselves at least once. If you get the chance to play it, or even already have, I hope you agree. Thanks for watching.
Rise and shine, Scaletta. You got yourself a visitor.
My name is Leo Galante. I heard you wanted to speak to me.